How are societal interests represented in the political system? Interest groups play a key role in all political systems, including the EU. We will now look at some theories. The classical theory of interest group representation is pluralism. The organizing idea here is that open access to policymakers provides check and balances against powerful state officials or the capture of a policy by a particular interest group. The assumption is that for every group pressing on one side of an issue, there's another group that are promoting the opposing view. As issues cross across the group structure, the coalition of groups promoting one view against the view of another coalition will vary. In other words, there are multiple oppositions to the interest of any particular group. There will always be countervailing powers against any well-organized group that try to promote its will against the interest of the broader public. For this to work, opposing interests must have equal access to the political system. If this is the case, all government officials have to do is to act as a neutral referee in this interest group game. But this is somewhat naive. In perhaps the most forceful argument made in political science, Mørker-Olsen argues that the relatively small group will be able to organize and act in support of their common interest, while large, perhaps more heterogeneous group will less frequently be able to do so. As a result, there is not a symmetric struggle between different interests in society. The interests of the smaller groups are often able to prevail against the interest of the larger group. This is in contrast to what's supposed to happen in democracies, where the many are supposed to prevail over the few. However, the numerically but privileged few often trump numerically larger group. The former is generally organized and active, while the latter are poorly organized and inactive. The reason for this, according to Olsen, is the logic of collective action. There are strong incentives to join a group that seeks only benefits for its members. In contrast, there are weak incentives to join a group that seeks benefits for the society as a whole. The former, but not the latter, can ensure that only those that join obtain the benefits. Concentrated interests are thus better organized than diffuse interest. As a result, open access to government does not, as the pluralists preach, lead to a broad and representative collection of diverse interests being heard. Instead, it leads to heavy lobbying of public officials by concentrated and well-organized groups. The resulting policy promotes those special interests at the expense of society at large. To overcome politically biased outcome, two alternative models of interest group organization has emerged: the corporatist model and the neo-pluralist model. In the corporatist model, the guiding assumption is that the main division in society is between capital and labor. To promote the balance of power, organizations represent those two broad groups in society are granted monopolistic access to the policy process. So instead of open policy networks, representatives from business and labor unions meet with state officials to adopt a broad consensus over the policy. Alternatively, the neo-pluralist maintains that the biases in pluralism can be overcome if state officials are no longer neutral referees in the interest group game, but deliberately seek to grant underrepresented groups in society access to the policy process. The idea is that all groups that are affected by a policy should be heard. Those groups that lack the resources to effectively promote their views should be subsidized by the state. Both these alternatives have problems. The corporate models assume that interest boils down to class interest conflict between capitalists and workers. However, in modern society, these class divisions have eroded and new ones have emerged. It is not clear that women interests, the environment, consumer interests, and digital privacy rights are structured along capitalist versus labor division. In the corporate system, labor and business share producer interests against the interests of taxpayers and consumers. The requirement that labor and capital need to consent severely constrains the available policy option and with it the ability of government to enact necessary reforms. The critique against pluralism may be overblown. As the policy benefits to the concentrated interest rise, the incentives for those groups losing from the policy will also rise. At some point, these diffuse interests will be able to organize. There will thus be an equilibrium balance of interests that are not completely in line with the interests of the concentrated groups. More recent theories of interest group representation focus on information. As policymakers are unsure about the exact consequence of their proposal, they will listen to interest groups that can supply high-quality information about the likely consequence of the policy. In addition, if this information is costly for the group to supply, policymakers may pay more attention to it than if the information could be provided by them relatively costless. Finally, lobby group will be more likely to secure higher returns from lobbying policymakers with opposing views than focusing on those with similar views to their own. There are thus greater incentives for counteractive lobbying than what is often assumed in the criticism of pluralism.